Well, hello, I'm the artist known as Fake Zappa, otherwise known as Jason T. Ingram. I live in Oregon, where I was born and raised, and this is my messy little production studio music room where I keep my art and stuff like that. This is something I call the mocktail drum kit, and various stuff that I use for my monstrosities. Anyways, I would like to talk about being gay and disabled at the same time. It's actually quite common though, but it's funny how many of us are not acknowledged as having this dual stigma. I think of myself as having, boy, I have a lot of stigma for a white male landowner. But I was recently introduced to a Netflix show called Special. And there was a young man named, well, younger than me, Ryan O'Connor, or Connell. He was talking about his life, and he wrote this show. And even though it has to do with LA culture and gay culture is very similar. In fact, I even had a partner at one time who was in entertainment, and he was from the LA area. And there's something about that show which just was like, oh my gosh, that is so much like that culture. And it's really weird how, how the last resort you want to go to, if you can at all lie to somebody, is to save your life or the life of another. Like saying, no, I don't have Jews in my attic. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a hero because he lied, but for some reason, to avoid a little conflict, or because there's a little bit of insecurity involved, or whatever it is, to some cultures, lying is the first thing they do. And unfortunately, a lot of times when people come out of the closet, or when they're introduced to gay culture and they want to be accepted, they are real about being a sexual minority, but everything else is so damn fake. And so there was so much fake in that show, and some of it I didn't relate to because there was a lot of millennial talk, which I thought was really fun. How it's like they make an expression out of everything, or an abbreviation, or an emoji, or whatever it is. It was really something else. But I could relate to a lot of it, especially in the first episode. I think there was a character named Doug, and the Ryan character, the protagonist, was at some kind of physical therapy thing for his cerebral palsy, and he's talking to the guy who's the worker there, and I thought it was funny. He's like, I don't have enough self-esteem to get on Grindr. It's like, I think it works the other way around, actually. And then the other thing too is like, man, there's a lot of assholes on here, because I was on Grindr on and off. I mean, I'll get on it for a handful of weeks or months, and then I'm like, ew. I mean, Grindr is like really good if you want like somebody who's not your type, who wants to bend over for you and get barebacked and share all kinds of diseases and get, well, it seems like there's a lot of meth and a lot of hard drugs on Grindr, but I thought it was funny they made a reference on there with that. And this guy's like, well, there's a lot of asses or assholes or something, and he's looking around, and he keeps getting pictures of butts, and I don't know what it was, but I kept getting pictures of guys' butts that weren't even my type of butts that I like, and it was like, did they even read not only my profile, did they read my screen name? So that was one thing I could relate to. But the biggest thing I could relate to was like, boom, right off the bat, there was a reference to this guy that was in a power chair, and he comes in and he's getting like an over amount of attention from people, like, and he was like, I admire that guy because he's like, and I forget the way it was said, it was like, he's really disabled, or he's like, people aren't scared of him, he gets a lot of attention, he gets a lot of help, because it's so obvious that he is so physically disabled, and there's not the same kind of stigma. And I've noticed that too. I've gotten really uncomfortable around disabled people who are physically disabled and they're in some kind of mobility device, and I have a tendency to freak out with them because I don't know how much attention to give them and not to give them, because I've never been physically disabled and I don't know what it's like to be them, but I do know what it's like to not be accepted and to be looked down upon. I'm tall, so that would be figuratively speaking. But what I don't understand is what it would be like to get too much attention as a disabled person. And the fact that, like, there was this one guy, he's like, my arms are my legs. And he wheeled himself around. He was very strong and he was very good at it and very independent. And I insulted him as a result. And there's one guy that I was pushing around in a wheelchair one time, and I couldn't even use the word wheelchair because I thought that would offend him. So that's a whole nother thing, that being mentally disabled with mood disorders and other disorders that people are really freaked out about is something that I think people feel even more uncomfortable around me than I feel around physical disabilities. But anyways, back to this thing, this guy, and I think his name was Doug in the show, and he's like, I really admire that guy, and I'm just not disabled enough to be disabled. And he wasn't really gay enough to be involved in the gay community. And this character knew that he wasn't going to be accepted in especially mainstream Los Angeles gay community, which is funny because it's so much like where I live in the Portland area. There is so much about what's on the outside. And so people see me, and I used to lie about my disability. I did. I wouldn't really lie about it, but I would cover it up. I wasn't honest about it. I wouldn't say I'm not disabled, but people would ask me what I do, and I'd be like, oh, I do production work, and I play in bands, and I do this recording stuff, and I do art shows, and I'm giving them a false impression because I'm giving the impression that I'm actually making money at it, which I really don't. And it's like been a 30-year struggle where I only had, a period of time throughout my 20s and a little bit when I was like 30 years old, where I actually made a living teaching music and stuff like that. But I don't have that luxury anymore because I'm in disability status, which puts me somewhere between homeless people and, the working poor, sort of. And mainstream gay culture is very middle class, especially upper middle class. And then, of course, there is this sort of like affinity with high class living. And anybody on an upper middle class salary that doesn't have kids to support can afford to live a certain way. And when they do that, it gives them power, it gives them social status, they can throw big parties, they can do these things, and it's real. This shit is real when it comes to the gay community, especially in urban West Coast progressive educated circles. Now, I don't behave like they do. I don't talk like they do. I don't act like they do. And I'm an outcast. And when they find out my disability status, because it was about, somewhere between 5 and 10 years ago, I decided that, okay, they're going to eventually find out that I live on Social Security. And if they're a bigot, then I might as well find out ahead of time instead of ruin a friendship later on when they do find out and experience the heartache. I'd rather get the rejection right away than have to wait and then be friends with somebody, and then when they find out that, no, I don't make a living doing this, that then they see me as being dishonest. And they also see me as, because I don't have visible signs of disabilities, that they've already made up their mind ahead of time that I'm just as functioning as they are. And then there's this whole thing about acute mental illness, because sexual minorities are pretty much all fucked up. I mean, there's a couple millennials that are born into families that are accepting, and there's no stigma in their culture and their community, and they end up being pretty cool about it and not so extremely fucked up like baby boomers and a lot of Gen X folks like me as well. Even though my story is really weird, having been raised very close to the gay community, being disillusioned by it and running away from it and enjoying a very anti-gay community for half of my adult life. That's a whole nother story. But as far as this this Ryan guy in this story called Special, which is, it's great to binge watch because they're really short episodes and they're really cute. And sometimes there's some crude surprises that are in there that are like, oh my God, did they just say that? And there's even some nudity, and it's pretty intense. And it remains very light at the same time. And I like how they approached a very heavy subject in a very light way with these cute pastel colors and lowercase letters when you see, I mean, and the cutesy music, and everything was produced like a cutesy bubblegum ad. And at the same time, it's dealing with some really fucking heavy shit. And I really like how they covered that. And especially the way a gay man who was an outsider is viewing the gay community, because that's the way I've seen it. I grew up as an outsider in the gay community, viewing the gays and thinking, I don't want to be one of those because I'm not a part of that world. I don't talk that way. I don't act that way. I don't make friends like that. And I also get really nervous and anxious around crowds a lot. And so going to parties is almost traumatic. It's very triggering for me a lot of times. And it brings out the worst in me a lot of times because some people are so extroverted that they run away. And I do that a lot. But then there's people who get so nervous they lose control of their will, literally. And they get scared and they try to control a situation here. Would you stop doing that? Okay. Here we go. I will fix my suspenders. Okay, so what happens is that people have already made up their mind that I am a fully functioning person that might have some acute mental disorders like they do because they get depressed, because maybe of trauma and things like that, because of being a sexual minority. And so they've put me in the same category as being as functional as they are. And when I exhibit dysfunctional type behaviors, then it is so easy, especially with mood disorders and with psychotic features and delusional stuff, especially with heightened moods, irritable moods, things like that, is boom, character flaws. Not brain chemistry flaws, character flaws. And so this is what happens in most of the communities I've been to, especially the gay community and creatives, which is another sad thing too, because there's another group that's kind of fucked up. And so it's like, oh yeah, we're all fucked up. We can relate to you. But no, they can't relate to me. I asked a band leader one time, okay, how many times have you been locked up, institutionalized? Have you ever been in a rubber room? Have you ever been on medications after medications? Have you ever blah, 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 blah? And he's just looking at me and he's thinking I'm making this all up. You know, I would have liked to, for him to at least say, no, I haven't done any of this stuff yet. He just had this hardened heart towards anybody who suffers to the point when they want to die. See, I'm looking for a reason to live, because the suffering that I go through, not only just waking up in the morning and trying to get through a day without succumbing to depression, anxiety, self-harm, and things like that, and isolation. I mean, I'm fighting this stuff every day. I'm trying to find a reason to live. And meanwhile, it's hurting all of my relationships, because all I need is for people to make me feel safe and accepted for who I am. And that doesn't happen unless I'm around peers. And what I mean by peers is other people who suffer and with the same level of debilitating disorders and stuff. And there's folks that are really low functioning. And yeah, sometimes I admire them because they get this enormous level of care. If they have a visible, obvious symptom or mix of symptoms, then they get a lot of attention. Now, they do definitely get immediately ostracized because it's so obvious that, okay, this person's broken. I don't know if I have the resources to have a friendship, or it's not going to be an equal friendship. He's going to drain my resources. I mean, these things go on in the back of people's heads. And so that's why it's hard for people with, you know, obvious visible signs, like the guy I'm calling Doug, the guy in the wheelchair. You know, he goes into a place and he gets a lot of unwanted attention, but at least he gets attention. And then there's somebody who might be symptomatic and it's automatically viewed as a character flaw. So what would happen if somebody goes and wheels their wheelchair into a room full of high functioning people and they look down at this person, they say, why don't the fuck this person just walk out of that wheelchair and stop pretending that they're disabled? Why don't they just get a life and get a job and all this kind of stuff? I mean, people wouldn't do that to somebody in a wheelchair, but they do it all the time with people who have what I call invisible disabilities. And so what I saw in this show was this guy desperately trying to, he was even lying to try to be accepted. And the lie that he did in this show was that, and this is so funny, jaywalking and getting in a car accident is considered admirable. In fact, he was like top dog because he wrote this article about it. And so that gets me to another subject too, is that there are injuries and there are types of disabilities that people have that are accepted, and there are those that aren't. So somebody who, okay, for instance, my situation, born with a fucked up head, fucked up at the age of 1 and 2 years old, started into this life with not only messed up brain chemistry through DNA or whatever it was, and then coming into a life where I had immediate trauma followed by prolonged exposure to unsafe environments, which also causes PTSD. Fuck you, suspenders, or should I say braces, like my partner says. He's an Anglophile, so he calls them braces. And so what happens is that when people are kind of fucked up, that's kind of cool. Yeah, we all are, whatever. But when somebody is so fucked up to where it makes relationships difficult, that somebody's going to have to invest a little more grace, a little more understanding, a little more knowing about how to cope with somebody with trauma and with debilitating disorders. It just takes some education. It takes just knowing and understanding, which is what we're doing with the transgender community. We're educating people just in case you do meet a trans person, and there's a lot of different types of trans people, and I am always behind when it comes to learning, but I can tell you that most communities, even communities that have a very healthy ideology when it comes to mental health and even mental illness, and they might have a kind of a non-working knowledge, but they might have a clinical knowledge of what they think the mental health community is based on a clinical understanding or background. And that is not enough, because you can't tell people that have a clinical understanding about mental health about how to learn to cope with somebody who actually lives with it, who actually deals with it, and who experiences the isolation and the loneliness. And that's another form of trauma, and feeling unsafe, feeling like you don't belong. And so the Ryan character trying to get away from his mother, and that whole relationship of just feeling like I'll never be self-sufficient, that is such a tough thing to do, because even if I am accepted in society, they want me to be cured in order to be fully accepted. And you know what? I get a lot of fucking cures. Oh my God. If you're having a panic attack, there's something you could do with, I actually had a therapist tell me this one time. Take a bowl of ice water and put your head in the ice water, and it'll counteract the effects of the panic attack. And I'm like, yeah, right. But I thought I'd try it. I come back and I'm like, I tried it. And so there's always a magical cure when you go to a church, even a therapist, or when you go to somebody who lives with acute mental disorders and they're like, oh, I practice transcendental meditation and it totally cured me of all my anxieties, because, oh, I used to have this horrible anxiety. I used to go into like a roller coaster and my heart would beat a little fast and it was so horrible. And I'm thinking like, oh my God, they're comparing scars with somebody who's still bleeding. It's like me coming up to somebody in a wheelchair and saying, oh, I know how it is. I sprained my ankle in the 4th grade. It was miserable. Believe me, I had a cast for 6 weeks, but everybody signed it and they loved on me. And then I was up hopping and frolicking around for the last 20, 30 years. And so People don't treat physically disabled people that way, but there's something, well, I mean, they might, because I haven't asked enough of them. I'm sure there's somebody, if they go to some like hyper faith community, that's just like, if you just believe God enough, you'll leap out of this wheelchair, because I heard of somebody that heard of somebody years ago, and Oral Roberts prayed for them and they leaped out of their wheelchair, and it's the same God, they could do that. I mean, there's all that too, and I've been around that as well, but that's a whole nother thing. You don't get a lot of hocus pocus stuff in the gay community, but what you do get is this sort of idea that if I am symptomatic, then obviously I'm not coping with my illness enough. When in fact, if somebody thinks that, they should ask how much self-care I do and how much work it is to take care of myself with the type of self-care practices that I do. And that's a long list as well. And of course the medications, and trying to advocate for myself to get the right kind of care. It's exhausting. It's like a part-time job. Sometimes it feels like a full-time job, just being my own caregiver and needing a caregiver. In fact, I was even told that I need a caregiver at one time. I'm sort of in this limbo, kind of like the Ryan character, where he's too disabled to function in society, but not disabled enough to be in a care facility and to get that type of attention. And he's also somebody who can lie about his disability to most people. Most people didn't catch that. Prostitute said that, oh yeah, you have CP. I had a client or something with CP and blah, blah, blah. And so, it's interesting. Some people can pick up on my stuff, especially if I'm symptomatic, and they can look at me and say, yeah, fake Zappa, he suffers mentally and emotionally with trauma and all that kind of stuff, and I'm going to talk about it, or I'm going to make adjustments around that, and I'm going to treat him like my equal, but at the same time, I'm going to try to be resourceful in order to help him. Boy, that doesn't happen, but occasionally it does, and it's like, oh, thank you. And in the meantime, I feel like I have to tell everybody and brief them and train them, but unfortunately, when you're dealing with, coastal Americans in urban, progressive, educated settings, you just can't tell them anything. And then around conservative guys, a lot of times they're just sort of into this, right away it's into this tough love thing. That's kind of like the big thing. Oh, you just got to toughen up and blah, blah, blah and stuff. There's a lot of people that have been raised in those communities where it's just like tough, especially gays who are raised that way. Thank God I wasn't raised like that. I don't know if I'd be alive. I mean, having my head fucked with a lot was one thing though, but I didn't get the kind of abuse that a lot of LGBT people do, a lot of people of faith do, and especially disabled people when it comes to, hey, like the snap out of it thing. I mean, people around me, they know better not to use, a cliche term like snap out of it, but they talk to me as if they were to say that very thing. Like, I'm not doing enough to take care of myself, and if I was, I would be acting and behaving like them. Now, here's the thing. If I don't act like them, I don't behave like them, then they think that I'm going to do something that's going to hurt them. If they think I'm going to do something that's going to hurt them, they're going to protect themselves. If they're scared and they're in self-protection mode and self-defense mode, then they can justify whatever the fuck they want to do in order to protect themselves. And a lot of times, it's passive-aggressive forms of abuse. So what happens is most of the abuse that I suffer is behind my back. I don't know about it until suddenly I'm walking into a room and the people that treated me one way are all treating me a different way. And it's obvious what's going on. I don't know the details of it, but it's pretty fucking obvious what's going on. And when that happens, I mean, I'm 45 years old now. And when that happens over and over and over again in every single community that I go to in a certain type of ideology right now, it's been an ideology that treats invisible disabilities as a character flaw and as something that needs to be cured, and magically poof, and I'm okay and I'm just like them and they're not scared of me anymore. And here's a side note, this one's for free, is that one of my disorders is reacting to perceived threats, like germs, for instance. A lot of times germs is a perceived threat. It's really not as harmful as it really could be on a scientific level, but I react as if they're a lot more harmful than they are. And it's obvious. And people that are around me that know me or that experience that, they don't judge me for it too. And it's something I'm honest about and I cope with. But here's the thing, is that when people view me as somebody who is capable of doing more harm than I've ever done in my life, then they are seeing me as a perceived threat. And so I often tell myself this, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be the crazy one. Why are they acting crazy? And I see this a lot with high-functioning people. It's like they're behaving like a crazy person. And here I'm suffering like a crazy person. And I don't have the same rights and privileges that they are being a crazy person. And why are they acting so crazy? And why is their crazy accepted and my crazy isn't accepted? So that's some of the stuff I can relate to with the Ryan character, as far as like, he definitely had signs of that something was different with him. I tend to exhibit behaviors that make me look kind of like more like an eccentric, not somebody who necessarily suffers. And I mean, unless I'm like really symptomatic, which I typically don't go out in public if I'm that way. But when I am, it's really, really sad the way I'm treated. When I'm symptomatic, when I get into a community, especially one that has rainbow flags and we're so affirming of disabilities and sexual minorities, and you get to find out that's not true. It's really not true. It's just a label they put on themselves thinking they're saving the world. And I'm here to say that, hey, if somebody is in the situation where they're around people with disabilities that aren't necessarily visible, there's a lot of things that you can do. And it has to do with listening to the sufferer, not necessarily the stuff that you hear from the association of this or this organization, whatever it is that they do this training and diversity training. You got to hear it from the source. And when people ask me what things are like, which they really don't, like, hey, what's it like growing up with a hypnotherapist? What's it growing up with two psych majors and, you know, having an untreated, undiagnosed mental illness? Nobody's ever asked me that. They all think that, oh, I was raised by these powerful, important, educated people and it must have been wonderful. And it wasn't. And someday somebody's going to actually want to hear my story, because it's not a Hollywood story. My experience of conversion therapy wasn't the Hollywood cute boy that was raised with religious parents, like in Boy Erased, and everybody thinks that that's the way my story was. They've already made up their mind that they think my story is like that. Well, when they hear the real story, and when it exposes our weaknesses as an affirming and tolerant community, they don't want to hear it. In fact, right now, there is a couple of publicists who have continually rejected my story. They've come to me wanting to know my story, and then when they hear the story, and I'm even in tears telling my story, there is some stuff that is so like, oh, well, that's not Hollywood. That's not the kind of story that people want to hear. And also, well, who wants to listen to you because you're not recognized, which is a huge thing. It's a popularity contest. So here it is. My trauma and the things that I've suffered aren't cool enough because not enough people give me the attention based on other people that are more popular. It's really weird that the people that are like moderately fucked up have a story to tell, and those are the ones that want to be heard by the mainstream media. And what's sad is that mainstream media is so much in cahoots with the mainstream LGBTQ world, like Logo and most of the mainstream media, which is very liberal influence, and a lot of it comes from Los Angeles, of Los Angeles culture and that whole fakiness and stuff. And so I have to battle this stuff all the time, and it's not easy. But doing these videos, doing my activism is really helping to empower me. And I'm so thankful for anybody who can sit there and listen to me rant for this long. And I haven't even timed it, so I don't know how long I've been ranting. So thanks again, fakezappa.com, and I'll have more articles up about this stuff here soon.